Scott, thanks for joining me on the Order of Man podcast. Looking forward to having you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. I was let's see, I was talking with Jordan Harbinger, a mutual friend of ours, and I had listened to the conversation you had and asked if he'd make an introduction. I'm really glad he did because I just told you before we hit record that I just finished the book. And it was funny as I was thinking about it, I'm like, man, this is a great book. Unfortunately, everybody who needs to read it probably won't. But then I thought maybe that's some form of loserthink myself. So I'm really anxious to dig into this.
Well, one of the things that I recommend in the book is that people take a picture of it with their phone and just post it online whenever it would be useful for their part of the argument. So if I've said something in the book that's better than the way you could have said it yourself, just take a picture and post it. And that way other people get to see it secondhand.
Yeah, well, I think that that's probably the case for everything that you wrote in the book is that you said it much more eloquently than I would ever say it. That's one of my biggest challenges is engaging with people on social media. I tend to lose my cool. We'll say lose my cool more often than I'd like to admit.
Yeah, it's too easy because you're not in person. It's easy to be the angry person when you don't have to look somebody in the eye.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think the lack of, I don't know if humanity is the right term, but certainly when you have a disagreement with a neighbor or a family member, there's a lot more humanity because the medical issue that they're dealing with, or a little bit more of the nuances that they may be coming from with their experiences in life. And in that context, which you talk about in the book, gives you the ability for some, I don't know if mercy you would say, but just humanity in general.
Well, there's also no risk if you're just insulting strangers on the internet. But if you insult your neighbor, that's probably going to come right around and bite you in the ass sometime.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people talk about social media with this negative connotation towards it, and certainly it can be. I think learning the principles and the strategies you share in this book will definitely help, but social media is such a powerful tool for connection. I mean, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for the power of social media and everything that it represents.
Yeah, it's more than a communication tool. Sometimes things evolve and you say, "Oh, that's just a better way to communicate. It's just more communication. It's just a little better." But eventually, sometimes things will improve to the point where it's just a whole different thing. Where your phone used to be just hey, it's a way to make a phone call. Now you're a cyborg because you basically have your cell phone with you all the time and it augments your intelligence and connects you to the intelligence of the world. You're effectively a cyborg. And it just started down as, hey, here's a way to tell my friend I'm on the way to the restaurant. and it grew from there.
Do you think that people don't fully realize the potential of their phones and being a cyborg, which is why we are untrained, I guess you'd say, to use it effectively and correctly?
Well, technology sometimes moves faster than evolution, moves faster than society can catch up. So we're always going to have that, technology gets ahead of us and then we figure it out. So I think we're in the wrestling with it phase where what social media is and what it can do to people kind of caught us a little bit off guard. But I think people are figuring ways to cope now. There's a little more, I'd say, adult approach to the internet, although it has divided us into essentially two worlds and they barely speak.
You're talking about the digital and the physical realm or something else?
Well, I'm talking about in the digital realm, especially people don't want to communicate with the other side, don't want to watch their news, don't follow them on social media, but it obviously is translating to the real world as well.
It's funny. My wife and I were having a conversation the other day about, we were driving to DC, which for us is a 10-hour drive. And we were with our kids and they had wanted to listen to some music and they asked us to put on the one song that they wanted. And my wife and I kind of laughed because when we were kids, you didn't get to pick the one song. You had to listen through the entire tape to get to the song that you wanted. So you had to take the good with the bad. And I feel like in society anymore is you don't have to take the good with the bad. You can just select and handpick everything that you want to hear and everything that confirms what you already believe and everything that makes you feel comfortable. And you have to take nothing that might challenge anything that you believe or threaten who you think you are.
Well, you know, choice is sort of a double-edged sword. Everybody would want more choice if you gave them the option. Do you want more or less choice? People will usually say more, but it makes us less happy because we have more things we have to process and figure out, and then you have regret. Oh, I should have picked that other choice. But I remember the days when we had two good network channels we could watch on television, and the rest didn't come in clearly. And I think I was just as happy. You know, I complained more about having to sit through the commercials, but I don't think I was less happy as a person. So, you know, we have to watch out for the unintended consequences of this stuff.
How do you think then that you decipher between what is productive progress and what is maybe just noise?
Yeah, I say in Loserthink that one of the reasons you shouldn't say something is a slippery slope is that quite often that slippery slope is somebody else's progress. So, you know, if you went from you can't discriminate against gays in employment, well, it's a slippery slope. The next thing you know, they're going to be getting married. Well, now they're getting married. Now, depending on which, I guess, perspective you're taking, that's either progress, in my opinion, it's progress, but somebody else is going to say, well, it's a slippery slope. Look where it's heading. Next thing you know. Slippery slopes are something that can typically be ignored.
That's interesting because that one actually stood out in my mind, and you had, I believe, on that segment talked about gun legislation and regulation. And it's funny because you have things like red flag laws, and there was an issue that I was following on Instagram just over the weekend, and I've caught myself saying that is a slippery slope, and I'm trying to think about how I would better frame that because quite honestly, what comes to my mind is that if you open up, for example, red flag laws, there is some danger in that it continues to go down that path, regardless of what I'll or how you interpret that path to mean.
Well, to that, I would add what I call the Adams law of slow-moving disasters. When society can see a specific problem and everybody can see it and it's coming, but it's a ways off, we have an extraordinarily good track record as human beings for solving the problem. We didn't run out of food, even though the population was going up. We didn't run out of oil. We just figured out how to frack and make windmills and solar panels. And we didn't lose all of our power or we didn't lose all of our technology in the year 2000. And those were all things that we saw coming. They were very specific. You know, you didn't have to wonder about them. And I think the red flag laws and the gun confiscation risks, same thing. You can see the potential risk, and every person can see it. You know, even the people who wished all the guns would go away, we're all looking at exactly the same facts, the exact same likely outcome, and that's usually enough because I think the United States has so much pro-gun, feelings that I don't see that we're going to go to the next step. It would just be too hard. So I think things will slip until there's a reason for them not to slip anymore. And if that reason doesn't exist, somebody will invent that reason and insert it just to keep things from slipping. So look for cause and effect, not slipperiness.
Well, and the other thing I think you're alluding to here, and you mentioned this in the book, maybe in a different context, but you talk a lot about, or to some degree, about linear thinking, right? We think that we know everything that's going to happen, and we look at problems that we may be dealing with on the plane of what we already know, and yet we have no idea what the next 5, 10, 20, 40 years is going to hold that could completely render some of these problems obsolete and non-existent.
Yeah, we live in this semi-absurd existence where in order to know what to do next, especially if you're doing long-range planning and getting ready for the future, you have to make a prediction about what that future looks like. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to prepare for it. And most of our predictions are something like a straight line. Things will be in the future basically a straight line from what we can see today. Now, it turns out that that's literally the least likely future. If you had to bet, is it going to be something that's a straight line that we could predict from today or something completely unpredictable? You should always go for unpredictable. It reminds me there's some Tom Cruise racing movie, and some some experienced person. I'm going to butcher this story, but talked about what to do if you're in a crash situation and there's a bunch of smoke up ahead, and you see a car that's sort of spinning around, and then it disappears into the smoke. What do you do with your car? Stopping's too dangerous. And so I believe the guidance was to head toward the last place you saw the car, because that's the least likely place it will be. So straight line predictions are like that. The thing we predict to be is always the least likely thing, because you can't see any of the changes and the step functions and the inventions and the wars and the shocks. And that's what drives the future.
I'm just glad that you threw a Days of Thunder reference in this podcast. That's a great movie.
Days of Thunder. I couldn't remember the name.
That's what it is. Days of Thunder. Yeah. I love that movie. Yeah, no, it's funny because a lot of what you talk about in the book, especially with linear thinking and some of these other points that we'll get to, I'm sure, is you just reminded me so much of my financial planning days. That I'm not sure if you're aware, but that's my background. I was a financial advisor for 9 years, and I've been leading this organization and movement for the past almost 5 years now. But man, what you had talked about in there, specifically with linear thinking, how I would look at somebody's plan and I'd say, this is a perfect plan if everything goes according to plan. But we all know that that's not going to happen.
Yeah. So, but the alternative is even crazier. The alternative is to not have any kind of estimate for how the future looks and therefore not prepare for it. So we're in this absurd world where the thing we have to do doesn't make any sense and we know it, but we still kind of have to do it because the alternative is even worse.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a one size fits all. I don't think we always know the answer, but it seems to me that we just do the best we can with the most information we have available and adjust and adapt where necessary and as often as possible. And we seem to make it work just fine.
Yeah, that's my concept of the talent stack. So the idea that you don't know what the future holds, but you do know, and this is very predictable and almost never has an exception, that the more skills you can layer together that work well with each other, the more rare and valuable you'll be. Now, you don't know exactly where that will lead. You don't know exactly the job or the place you'll live, but you know that if you've got a whole bunch of talents that work well together, you're going to do well. And the person who doesn't have that is going to have a harder time.
Yeah, it is interesting because a lot of people, what they'll say is they'll say, what's order of man going to look like in 10 years? I'm like, I have no idea. If I'm being truthful and answering that question, I have no idea. If you would have asked me 5 years ago what I'd be doing today, I wouldn't have even remotely thought of anything close to what I'm doing now. But one thing I do know is that I know how to communicate well. I'm fairly good at networking and connecting with important and influential smart, intelligent people, and I can work hard. And I feel like even just those three variables will tend to play well in my favor.
Yeah, those are three skills that work really well together. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you're successful. And you kind of remind me of some of the best advice I ever heard. And I wish I knew where it came from. It was just some random millionaire who said it once. And the idea is that what's important is not what you want. What's important is what you decide, because deciding is different than wanting. And so, if you want to be successful, the advice is find out the price of success and then pay it. And the reason lots of people are not successful is that they find out the price. It's like, oh, I really have to work every day for 10 years, weekends and nights, and miss my family and don't get to go out much and get up early and all that. Well, that's what it costs. If you're willing to pay that price, your odds are pretty good. And if you're not willing to pay it, well, you better get lucky, because that's the only way it's going to work.
Well, I think you actually alluded to that in one segment of the book. You talked about the differentiating factors between those who are successful and those who aren't. And what you had said is the first factor is luck. The second factor is a belief that you could, and I'm paraphrasing here, change your circumstances or change your environment or your level of success. I can't remember exactly what you had said.
Yeah, essentially, one of the key differences between successful and unsuccessful people is who they blame. Successful people blame themselves, period. Even though there are things they can't control, they still say, well, I should have known if I was here that might happen. I should have gone where it was safer. I should have been more protected. I should have planned for that. So even though there are things you can't control, luck is out of our control mostly, you can certainly go where there's more of it. But generally speaking, the people who feel they have control over their life and their environment will act that way. And that's a really predictive variable for success.
Yeah, and what was fascinating about it too is you said that even if it's not true, right? Even if it's not true that they can affect that sort of change, the belief that they can is what makes them a success.
Right. So if you believe you could be successful, you would say, okay, why am I not successful so far? And you'd say, well, what can I do? Maybe I can add another skill. Maybe I can take a class. Maybe I can network with somebody and meet somebody who would help me. So if you think it's under your control, then your plans will reflect that. But if you think it's not under your control, you'll do today with the same thing you did yesterday. Came home, sat on the couch. I wished I were luckier, but that's not going to get you anywhere.
Right. Once my ship comes in, then I'll have the success. Then I'll have the relationship. Then I'll have the business or the bank account or whatever it is people are after.
Right. A lot of people look at successful people and they look for that point of luck. They say, well, I could do that too, but look, there was that point where this person met that person or they just fell into this situation and, you can't control that. But I would say that most lucky people have created energy and put themselves out there and allowed luck to find them. So I often say that luck doesn't come looking for you. You have to make noise. You have to go out in the world. You gotta make energy. You've got to change things. And then you have a real good chance that luck will find you because luck is attracted to energy. That's a good rule for life.
Yes, I can see that it would be. And the other thing about luck too is it's not, or fortune, whatever I would prefer to use the term fortune, but I think we're on the same page. It might just be semantics there. Is although there may be fortunate events in your life, and certainly I can point to fortunate events in mine that I have absolutely no control over, you still have to act upon that. It isn't a guarantee just because you were fortunate, just because you had loving parents, or just because you were born in the United States, or just because you were born the son of a wealthy father. That's a factor, but not the only factor.
Yeah, and people don't get to see all the times the successful people fail. And if you don't see that, you think, oh, well, you tried one thing, you got lucky. I guess there's no skill involved, you just got lucky. But if you saw all the things I've tried that haven't worked, and usually if I could look at any one of those and say, the reason it didn't work is I had bad luck. They've had some really bad luck, examples in various investments, et cetera. But when you look at the one that worked, Dilbert in this case, or writing books, there was a huge piece of luck that made them work. So the things that didn't work were bad luck. The things that did work were luck. But the one thing that I had control over is how many things I did. And I just did things until one of them got lucky. So I used sort of just the fact that energy would attract luck and eventually it would find me.
Yeah. Well, I talk a lot about the difference between accepting blame and accepting responsibility. There might be things in your environment and circumstances that are not your fault. Like you shouldn't blame yourself for that. But if it's in your environment and in your sphere of influence and the things that you want to create, then although it may not be your fault, certainly you probably ought to take some level of responsibility for it if you hope to improve it.
Yeah, that's a real healthy way to see the world. When you talk about blame, you start feeling that sort of suggests words like guilt or shame. And I'm not in favor of any of that stuff. Do the best job you can. But sometimes things don't work out and there's nothing you can do. You can't go back in the past. Maybe sometimes you just can't fix it. So taking responsibility, even when you maybe don't have full control over the situation you're talking about, is just a great mindset because we can control more than we think we can. I like to use the example of If you're trying to deal with other people, you say, okay, well, it's not up to me. This other person has to hire me. This other person has to want to invest in me. It's not up to me. But we influence those people by our actions. And if you learn how to influence people, that's one of my earlier books, Win Bigly. If you learn how to persuade, then it is up to you, because what you do turns those other people into different versions of themselves. And some of those versions are good for you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and now you're getting into the sphere of, influence and leadership, and what a lot of people will try to do. I think this is not exclusive to men, but I think generally men is they try to strong arm every situation, right? If I can lead and dominate the circumstances and the environment and the people around me, then they will follow me, and then we will accomplish X, Y, and Z. And I think that's probably more akin to dictatorship or tyranny than it is leadership. Leadership is about influencing and controlling yourself first, and then ultimately giving people the opportunity to decide whether or not they're going to be influenced by you.
Yeah, leadership is sort of a strange job, if you will. I've often said that I would be a bad leader because I can't convince people to do things that are bad for them. And that's something you have to do. In other words, you have to say, this would be good for the whole country or the company or whatever, but it's going to be bad for you. You're going to have to work all weekend, or you'll have to go fight this war. But trust me, even though it's really bad for you, it'll be great for other people. Now, to be a leader, you've got to be able to say that and sell it. And I don't feel that I could sell that, honestly, telling people to go sacrifice themselves. So I'd be a bad leader in that sense.
But, I might push back on that a little bit, because we don't get to decide for that other individual. Let's say fight a war. So I'm a veteran. I served in the military. And although I was commanded to go to Iraq in 2005 and 2006, I found a lot of meaning and significance in that sacrifice. And so there was purpose and there was accomplishment and fulfillment for me, although somebody else might interpret it that sacrifice is not good for an individual. I actually think I'm a better man because I had that circumstance.
Yeah, everybody has a different relationship with those kinds of situations. I feel as though the way I'm built, just my DNA, I probably could not have come home from a war zone even if I hadn't been physically injured. I just don't think there'd be much left. But there are other people who are just made of stronger stuff. I'm guessing you're one of those. And people tend to know themselves. You kind of know if you have a good chance of getting through something like that or not. I'm just glad the world is full of people who can do that stuff, so that the people who can't, get the benefit.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the world takes all kinds. And this is something I feel like I'm learning myself. Maybe it's a level of maturity or intelligence or just what kind of happens over time with enough experience, is that I used to think, it's got to be my way, that my way is always right, that if everybody was this way, then the world would be a better place. And if everybody thought like this, then the world wouldn't be so insane. And what I'm realizing is that, maybe if everybody thought that way, the world would actually be more insane. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can't do much about other people except try to survive them.
Yes, yes. And influence, right? And influence those individuals as well.
Yeah, influence is one of those things that unless it's somebody you're with all the time, it's hard to influence them much. So when you're talking about politics or something, you can try influencing for, 3 solid years, and you're lucky if you can move that 1 or 2% of independence one way or the other. So influence is a very weak force and has to be either applied to large populations where you just try to move a few of them, or if you're trying to influence one person, you got to spend a lot of time. It's a weak force that can build over time.
Well, I think you actually alluded to this in the last segment of the book when you talked about your priorities and how we sometimes tend to get these backwards. I know a lot of guys who listen to this podcast certainly do, because they'll place themselves, for example, at the bottom of the totem pole of priorities. And I think there's noble intentions in that. They want to serve their families, they want to serve their friends and their communities and their employers and clients and everybody else but themselves. But I've found that the better we serve ourselves first, the more capable we are of serving the next person, which would I would assume, and in my case would be my spouse, and then it would be my children, and then it would be my close associates and friends, and then it would be the people who organize around this movement, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I recommend a form of enlightened selfishness. The idea being pretty much what you said, which is if you don't take care of yourself first, somebody else is going to have to take care of your ass eventually. So, job one is to make sure you're not a burden on other people, especially your family. Now, if you can take care of that and take care of your family, as you said, a few of us have been lucky enough because our careers worked out or whatever, that we could take care of our families and friends, and then we start looking at a larger picture. Because I think we're kind of just designed that way, biologically, evolutionary wise, whatever. There is something in you that clicks once you know you've taken care of everything locally, and you just automatically think, all right, now who can I help next? I took care of business locally. So that's kind of where I'm at in my career arc. My books, for example, the periscopes I do, they all have a common theme, which is it's got to be good for the people who are watching, something that'll help them lead a better life, make better decisions, that sort of thing. Because I feel that's where I should be focusing now, because everything close to me is taken care of.
Yeah, I almost feel like and have thought about it as a video game in a way. You start at this bottom tier and you learn a set of skills and then you level up. And with that level up comes greater responsibility, harder missions to accomplish, but you need those skills you learned in level 1 to get to level 2 and 3 and so on. And I kind of feel that same way when it comes to being able to take care of a family, or serve in the community, or lead a movement or an organization like yours or mine. Like, you're never going to be able to get to that point unless and until you develop the level 0 and the level 1 skills so you can move up the ladder.
Yeah, you gotta start there. So I think we're on totally the same page there. Take care of yourself first. And I always say, make sure that, sort of a good way to test whether you're taking care of yourself is if you're making time for exercise. If you can't find time for that, it's almost certainly because you're putting other priorities higher. And in the short term, it always makes sense. Oh, I'll work overtime today. I'll, go to my kid's game. They're all good things. But if what you've sacrificed is your long-term health, it's going to come back and bite you.
Right. I mean, there's seasons, right? So yes, there may be a deadline that you need to hit or some task that you have 30 days to get accomplished. And that's a season. And then you go back into making sure that you're resting and recharging and taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I think you need to develop systems too. And I talk about that in one of my earlier books about if you could say I have a rule of, let's say, working out at lunch. Then it's easier to schedule your day. If somebody says, can we get together, not to do it at lunch. So it just makes everything easier if you have sort of a standard rule. Even if you can't do it every day, it's good to have a rule.
Yeah, and I think you talk about that as being, I don't want to say priority or take precedence over goals, but you say work on systems before goals or in conjunction with goals, something along those lines. Maybe you can help me clarify that.
Yeah, so I say that goals can be a problem because while you're working on a goal, you're in a state of failure because you have not achieved your goal yet. And then once you achieve it, you set a new goal and then you go back into your failure mode. Whereas if you have a system, you can succeed every day at the system. And that might give you lots of opportunities that are even better than the goal that you might have picked. So in the case of fitness, I talk about getting yourself addicted to it by making sure that you have a time to do it, a system to do it. But you also reward yourself. You don't work out too hard and hurt yourself. You just make sure you enjoy it. And that takes some experimenting to make sure that's the case. Once you're mentally addicted to exercise and you've carved out some time in your day, you turn a thing that used to be hard into a thing that you prefer to do. I actually look forward to going to the gym because I like my downtime afterwards and the protein shake I have afterwards, getting change of scenery, etc. So work on your mental addiction to exercise first. That's the way to get there.
Yeah, this reminds me of the system, in fact, that we use for setting and accomplishing goals. We start with a vision. How do we want to show up? What do we want to look like? How do we want to affect the environment around us? Work into specific goals. Okay, here's some goals that I'd like to accomplish. But I think most people stop there, and where they stop, we go deeper. We say, okay, now what are the tactics? What are the things that you can do on a daily basis that will inevitably lead you towards that objective? And then we measure it along the way with checkpoints, 30-day and 60-day checkpoints, to ensure that our systems or our tactics are getting us to where we actually want to be, and adjust accordingly.
Yeah, and I also note that the world used to be simpler. And when the world was simpler, it made more sense to have a goal for what you're going to do next year. So let's say you're a farmer and you had a goal of clearing the trees from 10 acres before next planting season. When the next year comes around, that's still a perfectly good idea because nothing changed. But if you take today, any goal that you have that's a year from now, the entire industry could be gone. You may say, hey, I'd like to be a truck driver. And then you open up, your web browser and find out that Tesla just made a self-driving truck.
Right.
And
right.
Well,
did you buy one of those?
No, not yet. But I'm kind of liking the new Tesla Cybertruck. I have to say, I disliked it when I first saw it, but it's growing on me in a way that's almost magical. So there's some kind of weird sorcery they use to make people like stuff. But
Yeah,
I
who
kind
knows?
of want
Well,
one now.
They make it cool, and they make it a little mysterious and edgy, literally and figuratively as well.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense in that things are complex and they're ever changing. And the other problem I see with goal setting too is that you, in a way, pigeonhole yourself into something. You use the example of a truck driver. Well, if you're so focused on that or farming or whatever it used to be, then you can't see other opportunities that will present themselves. I mean, the taxi cab industry is a perfect example. These organizations are fighting so hard to keep things at the status quo, when if they would just learn and open themselves up and expand their horizons and open up new potentials and possibilities, none of that stuff would even matter. But they're just fighting for the old way. It's really fascinating.
Well, I suppose if you owned a medallion,
Of course.
you'd paid a ton of money to have a rights for a cab, and then the
Sure.
Uber's coming in and eating your lunch. You're going to fight to keep the old ways as long as you can. So there's a financial incentive for that.
There is. I think there's a short-term financial incentive, but there's a long-term risk in clinging that status quo and not realizing that, frankly, it's inevitable. So the sooner I think you can accept that and embrace it and look for opportunities, long-term, I think you're going to be better off.
Yeah, if it turns out you were a cab driver with one skill, that's a big problem. But if you were adding to your skill and your talent stack, well, maybe you can pivot to something better.
Mm-hmm. I want to rewind. I feel like I got ahead of myself a little bit because I was so excited to jump into some of these topics and things like this. But the title of your book is Loserthink: How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America. What is loserthink? Help us understand what you mean when you say that.
So I invented a term to describe the situation where people might be smart and well-informed in general, but you see ridiculous arguments coming from them. Now, sometimes it's just, confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance and people being silly. But what I noticed is that there was a consistent pattern. I would click on the profile of somebody on Twitter who had said something smart, and I'd see what kind of life they have. Because, usually the profile will say something about them. And often it would be an economist or a lawyer, or engineer, or scientist, the types of areas where you learn how to think. Whereas I'd hear a bad argument and I'd look at it and it would be artist or poet or musician. And I would think, there are actually areas, and I'm an economist by training, in which they teach you how to think. An economist literally learns how to compare things rationally. And people who have not learned how to think the way that people do in various different disciplines, and it's a little different in each discipline, those people are under the impression that their common sense is all they need. They look at a situation in the news and they say, well, okay, I'm going to common sense this. How hard could it be? And I like to use this one example to show the blind spot. If you say to the average person, is President X, it doesn't matter which president, doing a good job or a bad job, they'll almost always give you an opinion. They'll say, yes, great job, or no, bad job. But if you ask an economist the same question, more often than not, sorry, my nose is itchy. You ever get an itchy nose when you're on camera? That happens to me all the time.
That's the only time it itches is when you're not supposed to scratch it.
There's no way that you can scratch your nose without looking like it's something different.
Right. Just own it. It's fine.
What was I talking about?
You were talking about how an economist would approach that question of, is he doing a good or bad job?
Right. So if you ask an economist, is the president doing a good job? If they're a good economist, they're going to say the following: compared to what? Mm-hmm. Because that's what economists learn. Now, the problem is that there's no such thing as a president who's doing the job at the same time as the real president. There's nobody with the same variables, the same everything, but they're just making different decisions. So you could say, oh, these decisions came out better. So the person who doesn't know that unless you have a valid comparison, you're just talking out of your butt, because there's nothing that can be compared to. You can't say if it's a good one or a bad one unless there's something extreme going on, of course.
Sure.
So that's just one of many examples in Loserthink, where you just have to be exposed to this other way of thinking, and you immediately can incorporate it, because just what I explained would allow somebody to say in the next situation, oh, compared to what? It's as simple as learning it the first time.
Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. We ran across this in the financial planning practice as well. People would say, is this a good investment relative to what investment, and what does good mean? Does that mean there's low risk? Does that mean there's potential for high return? What do you mean by good? Sometimes that's a little frustrating to people because they think that you should just be able to interpret what it is they're after, but we can't, right? And you talk a lot about that in the book as well, is that we don't have the ability to read minds and interpret what people are thinking and feeling in any given moment.
So let me give you one of my favorite examples, because with your background, this will probably hit better. When I built my house back in 2009, I had the decision of putting solar panels on it or not. Now, the calculation was that if I spent X amount for the solar panels, they would pay back in, 5 years or something. And I was sure I was going to keep the house longer than that. So I was like, oh, good investment, right? Put in X amount of money, it pays back in 5 years, no brainer. But unfortunately, I'm also a trained economist, and I did financial analysis for a living. And the additional facts that I knew is that the installation costs were going to be dropping every year, and a lot. So that if I waited 5 years and then put it in, I would have overspent for my electricity for 5 years, but by the time I put it in the system, it would cost maybe 20% as what I had 5 years earlier, and it would be way more efficient and save me way more money. So if you're not trained in economics, you don't know things like the time value of money, you haven't incorporated the inevitable improvements in technology, you just look at the situation and you say, well, it pays for itself in 5 years. Of course, why wouldn't I? But there's always a deeper level.
I think this comes into what you had talked quite a bit about as well, is the differences between short-term thinking and long-term thinking, and how it's advantageous to think over long periods of time. Even if we don't quite know what's going to happen, looking at the long play seems to play out better in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I've often thought that what we see as disagreement on climate change is inability to understand how to look at the future. And the people who are better at it are coming to different conclusions than people who don't know how that's done, or don't even know that it's a learned skill. So, for example, the UN recently, a few months ago, put out an economic forecast that in 80 years, the cost of climate change, if unchecked, because they're assuming it's warming, would depress the GDP 80 years from now by 10%. Mm-hmm. Now, that was supposed to scare us because that would be trillions of dollars and it would be a real big deal. But if you've studied economics, and you're probably ahead of me on this, you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, in 80 years, our GDP will have gone up by 5 to 10 times from what it is now. So if the only effect is that in 80 years it's 10% less than it could have been, we're not going to even notice because it'll be almost 5 times better, but it could have been 5 times better. We won't even notice. Literally, you wouldn't know the difference. So, the UN puts that out to scare people, and of course it works. So as persuasion, it works. But I look at the numbers and I say, first of all, nobody can do an 80-year financial projection. That's not a thing. Because somewhere in that time, we're inventing fusion. We've got flying cars. Everything's going to be different by then. We're already developing technology that can suck the CO2 out of the air if we need it.
Mm-hmm.
And people worry that we'll take too much of it, but I'm pretty sure we'll turn it off if that becomes a problem. So
unless the robots have taken over by then, and there's nothing we can do about it at that point.
Yeah, I mean that's the perfect example. The whatever the change in civilization that comes from the robot, apocalypse, is going to happen in that 80 years for sure, and that's all bets are off at that point. We don't know, will we all be collecting UBI? Will it be easy to move? Let's say the biggest problem of climate change is that people have to move. Well, what if in 80 years you just open your app and you say, it looks like they're hiring over in Bangladesh.
Right.
I guess I'll grab my self-driving Uber and I'll be in Bangladesh in 2 days and I'll have a new job. So Everything's going to be different. So I think the people who are most frightened by climate change are perhaps, in some cases, not all, least qualified to look at the future and make a good guess about what that's going to look like.
Well, I mean, climate change is an interesting one anyways, because I don't think that there's any rational human being who believes that we ought to be cognizant of the way that we're impacting the climate. Whether you're a climate change skeptic or believer, I think everybody believes that we probably impact the climate, and then we ought to be aware of how we're doing it. It just seems so polarizing, and a lot of that obviously comes from the media and their whole model is designed to get us fighting and riled up, but we fail to see that quite often.
Yeah, I talk about this in the book. There was this one small technological change that you wouldn't have really noticed as important, but it ruined everything basically. And that's the ability to measure with precision who is clicking on what and watching what. Once
and
you
why,
know that,
right?
yeah, and why. And once you know that, you've got to pursue that. If you're a public company and you've got stockholders, you've got to go where the profit is. So the profit is in things that set your hair on fire and not so much boring old facts that would be nice to know. So we're in a world where everything seems worse than it is because the business model of how to communicate what is has changed.
And I found that once you understand that and accept that that's actually what's going on, life becomes a whole lot calmer, a whole lot easier, and a whole lot more efficient because you're focused on things that actually move the needle versus things that are just distracting you from producing results in your immediate circle.
Yeah. Just for fun, if you tried to become like a fake psychic, and I do this sometimes too, try to make predictions based on all the worst case scenarios won't happen. So you just take every news item and say, all right, I predict that won't happen. I predict that we won't all die from climate change. I predict that ISIS will not form a caliphate again. You could just go right down the line. I predict there will not be a depression, and I think you'd be fine. You would be right, certainly 9 out of 10 times.
Well, I think you'd be right as much as anybody else who's guessing about everything else that's going on.
It may be better, because the idea is that, and I heard or I read a blog post about this that made everything make sense to me. It was Scott Alexander wrote about this, that it's not a coincidence that the news is so ridiculous sounding, because the things that get people to click are the things that actually are not true. If something is true, it usually looks like it's in the family of things that are ordinary and therefore not interesting. But if
or
you
maybe
see
that
a story,
you already know, right? If it's true, it's like, yeah, got it. I know that.
Right. Yeah. So if you see President Trump sent a tweet insulting somebody, you're like, well, that doesn't make my hair on fire. That's just
Right.
normal.
What's new?
But if you heard that he slayed a baby and ate it in front of the press, you'd say to yourself, my God, you'd click it, you'd share it, and then 2 days later you'd find out it wasn't true, which is the way most of our news is going these days. 48 hours later, it wasn't what you thought it was. That's the most common thing that we see now.
Yeah, this is one of your rules, right? The 48-hour rule is, just let it simmer for 48 hours and then you can maybe dissect it to the degree that you want.
Yeah. Yeah, and the more absurd the story sounds when you first hear it, the more likely you should wait. My favorite example is the Russian sonic weapon. So it was the idea that there was some secret sonic weapon that was being used on the embassy personnel in Cuba. Now, the first thing I said was, it's not a supersonic weapon, because that's the ridiculous story. That's what makes it interesting.
Right.
If the whole story was that some people were sick in an embassy and you didn't know why, well, I don't know if it would be that different than probably lots of corporations, lots of buildings. There are probably lots of places where you have clusters of people with mysterious symptoms. It's probably a fairly ordinary thing. But as soon as you throw in the secret sonic weapon, click, 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 I got to find out more about that secret sonic weapon. So on day one, I predicted in public, no secret sonic weapon. And so far, they can't find a secret sonic weapon, but they have some other theories of what might be causing it, but not a secret sonic weapon.
Surprise, surprise, right?
Right.
How do you know if you're engaged in Loserthink? Because I imagine all of us, I know all of us have engaged in Loserthink, and I imagine that when you are most guilty of engaging in it, you are probably least aware of engaging in it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the basic problem with life, is that when you're the one who's being fooled, how do you know? Because you're the one who's being fooled by definition.
Sure.
So the best you can do is familiarize yourself with the basic, let's say, failures of Loserthink, and then let other people remind you when you're doing it. My favorite one is people like to do mind reading, I call it, which is to not just look at what people are doing or the words they're saying, but to imagine you can determine a stranger's inner motives. Oh, sure, they're saying that for this reason, but the real reason is X. And you see this continually in the news. The real reason is it's part of his secret plan to destroy the earth or whatever it is. And I counsel people that we don't even know what our spouse is thinking most of the time. I mean, you can't tell what your best friend is thinking. Even the people closest to you, you're routinely surprised that you think they're angry, but they're not. You think they're happy, but they're not. So what are the odds that you know the secret inner thoughts of a stranger you've never met on the other side of the country? Pretty low. Now, there's some obvious ones. You can tell, when politicians are doing things that are just political. That's pretty obvious. But once you go beyond the obvious, don't assume that this is step one for forming the next Nazi regime or whatever it is that people are imagining today.
That thought right there has just made my interactions on social media that much more bearable, because I'm not worried about trying to interpret what somebody thinks. I can interpret what they're saying and decide for myself if this is something worthy of my attention or not. But I don't have to play this game of guessing what they think or what they don't think and then debating what they believe versus what I believe about. It's crazy what we get wrapped up in. And I'm telling you, I read this book over the weekend and last week, and just in the week or so that I've had some of this information, my engagements on social media have been so much better and less stressful because I'm just not wrapped up in the game that I see a lot of people playing, and frankly that I'm guilty of playing as well.
Yeah, and once you've seen some of these little techniques, there's sort of a natural barrier to using them, because I use the power of mockery. Mm-hmm. Which is one of civilization's most important forces, because there are things that you could get away with that you still don't do because you don't want to be mocked. When I say get away with it, you won't go to jail for it.
Sure.
But you don't want to be mocked. You don't want to be embarrassed. And so given that there's a book called Loserthink and somebody might be taking a picture and appending it to your tweet, it's a little bit of a counterforce to make people not do the obvious bad things. I'll give you another example. Analogies. People like to use analogies as a replacement for reason or for thinking. Now, analogies are great for explaining a new concept for the first time. If you wanted to tell somebody what a zebra was and they'd never heard of a zebra, you'd say, well, it's sort of like a horse, but it's got stripes. So it's a good shorthand way of describing things. But where we go wrong is what we use it to predict. And so, we'll say, my cat has markings under its snout that look like a little Hitler mustache, so I think my cat's going to invade Poland. Now, when you hear that example, you say, oh, that's a crazy example. There are no real ones like that. But all you have to do is look at the news.
Yes.
And you see that President Trump is being criticized for criticizing the press. And what do people say about that? Instead of asking the obvious question, or it should be obvious, which is the press doing something to deserve it? Is there anything that changed? And the answer is yes, something changed. The press is no longer the legitimate, neutral voice it used to be. So the president has every right to criticize them, and it might even be good for the country that he's doing it. So if instead you use the analogy way of thinking, you say, wait a minute, who else criticized the free press? Dictators.
Right.
So that's where it's all going. The president's
right.
it's step one of his plan to never leave office. So
yes,
analogies
his grand
are
master plan.
Analogies are bad for predicting. And until you hear that for the first time, you don't really know that's true, because people will routinely use it as sort of their common sense that, well, if it looks like this, it might go the same way as that thing it reminds me of. But usually it's just two things remind you of something, and that's it. That's the only connection.
This is a very important distinction for men to know, because I'll tell you one situation that we deal with quite a bit is, and there seems to be a growing movement among men to embrace the idea that because they happen to have one or two or maybe even a handful of bad experiences with women, that somehow women are the enemy and we need to go our own way and we need to not be in these relationships. And my thought is, okay, you had a bad experience with a woman or a handful of women, but that doesn't mean that all women are that way. It doesn't mean that your relationship is destined to be that way, and relationships or marriage in general is a failed institution. It means that something didn't work out in the past. So figure out why it didn't work out and then correct whatever needs to be corrected. Nothing more than that.
And yeah, that gets back to taking responsibility too, because I'll tell you my college insight I had. In college, I smoked a lot of marijuana, and I would notice that when I was high, other people seemed nicer. And I thought for years, well, that's just because I'm high, that my perceptions are changed. They're not actually nicer. I'm just perceiving it that way. And it was many years later that I realized that I had it backwards, and that I was causing them to be nicer by my demeanor. And you can see this in yourself. I sometimes will look kind of intense if I'm just thinking deep in thought or something, and people will react to me the same way I'm presenting myself. So if I'm tense or tense looking, they'll get tense because they're thinking, what is the situation? Do I need to be tense? You're tense. Is there danger? But if I go into a situation completely relaxed and loose and laughing, more likely the other person is going to pick up my pattern and start to be looser and laughing themselves. So once you learn that other people's decisions are actually largely in your control, so you control not only your own decisions, but by how you present yourself, you control what they do and what they think and how they act. And until you realize that it's you causing them to act the way they want, you're going to think it's like, well, there's another bad woman. I got another bad one.
Right. When you're the only common denominator in this whole equation, right?
Right. 10 in a row. I keep getting bad ones. So, yeah, there was an old comic about this. There was a guy in a prison cell, and he was saying to his cellmate, he goes, 17 arrests, 17 convictions. Maybe it's me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I get that a lot too. My demeanor tends to be a little bit more serious. Of course, I've got the beard and things like that. And people I don't know, even my wife at times, why are you so angry? What are you mad about? I'm like, I'm not mad. I'm studying or I'm focused or I'm thinking about something else. And so you were talking about that earlier, is like we can't even interpret those who are closest to us, let
Right.
alone those who are not. But it is interesting because I'll hear a lot of guys say it's this, and I'm sure you're aware of this. It's the zero F's mentality, right? Zero F's given. Like, I don't care what anybody else thinks, or it's just the way that I am, so that's somebody else's problem. It's like that's a weird thought, because you realize that you're capable of changing who you are simply because you want to. Like, you do realize that, right? And it's weird because I think there are people who don't understand that.
Yeah, one of the best pieces of advice was from Dr. Laura. She used to be on the radio. I don't know if she still is,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
she was talking about philosophically that who you are is what you do. It's not what you think. So you are not your internal thoughts. You are what you do. So if you want to be a different person, do something different, because that's who
Right.
you are. If you have evil thoughts all day long, but during your day you're feeding the hungry and doing good deeds, that's who you are. You're not the thoughts. You're the person who's feeding the hungry and doing the good stuff. So to those people, they can be different people, and if they become that different person, ideally an improved version of themselves, they will influence other people with that improved version. So they have not only control over themselves, who they are at a fundamental level, but they can control other people's behavior by just being that different person.
Yeah, this is what you talked about in the what I would dub the solutions chapter of the book, or section of the book, when you talk about uh, change what you do to change the way you think. I believe is what you said, or something along those lines.
Yeah. How often have you seen this situation? And I remember when I first got stepkids years ago, and my ex-wife would say, they'd be acting up, and she'd say, "Oh, it's just because they're hungry." And I'd say, "No, it's not. It's not that. They're just being bad. There's
Mm.
nothing to it. They're just being bad." And then she'd say, "Watch this," and she'd give them hot dogs, and they'd sit there like little angels eating their hot dogs, and
Yeah.
then they'd be good for a while after that until they were tired, or somebody stole something from the other kid or whatever. But then I started to look, well, is that true with adults? Are we just as simple that if we're not, if we're, let's say, tired or stressed or hungry or whatever, do we act that way too? And the answer is yes. I mean, you can see it in adults just as clearly, how they act before they eat versus after they eat, after a nap, before a nap, all that stuff. It's if you want to feel different, put your body in a different situation. So that might mean go get some entertainment that cheers you up, leave the house, get in the sun, do a different activity, exercise. There are 100 ways to do it. But if you don't like where your head is at, put your body somewhere else, because your body
Mm.
leads your head.
I like that. Yeah, we call it hangry around here when a child, or in our case a husband, me, is hungry. I tend to get a little unbearable at times.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, I think any guy who's listening to this probably can. Just throw some food at us, and we'll be good to go for another couple hours before we need to eat again.
I often have reduced my happiness to just a few elements. And I say that if in a 24-hour period I can get some work done, have exercise, and in a perfect world, have some, loving from my beautiful girlfriend, that's like a perfect day. But if I could get at least one of those, ideally two of them, I still have a pretty good day. But if I
Yeah.
don't get any three, like if I don't accomplish anything, I don't exercise, and I don't have any, alone time with Christina, I'm almost always in a bad mood. Almost always. And if I get two and a three, good mood. If I get all three, great mood. And it's very consistent. So how much of it is my free will? How much of it is just my internal thoughts? None of it. It's all external stuff that determines my mental state.
Yeah, that's interesting. And isn't it a nice way to live when you break it down to that little framework? I just need these three things, and I'll be satisfied and happy and fulfilled.
And by the way, it took me decades to learn the correlation, because there are lots of things happening in your life. There are all kinds of variables, and the one you usually look at is like, oh, that other person made me mad.
Right.
I'm mad because the person didn't return my call, they didn't deliver, they raised the price. You always think it's other people until you eat, and the other people didn't change,
Right.
and now you're okay with them. I'm
Right.
suddenly okay with those people. I had some food. So,
Interesting. How do you determine what battles are worth? Maybe battles is not the right word, but what to engage in and what not to? I imagine just via the nature of your work as a political commentator and illustrator that this is part of your job. It's certainly part of mine to engage on social media to share my thoughts and ideas. But I think there's a large swath of the population who really don't need to engage in these things, and they do. It's like what metrics do you use to determine whether this is worthy of your engagement or not?
well, I'm a special case because part of my engagement is for my own entertainment. Part of it
Sure.
is for research. I'm always seeing, okay, will this kind of a comment give me this kind of a response, or will it persuade or not? But people also follow me to follow the comments
Sure.
because I have a pattern of witty put downs for people who deserve it. And so they watch it for the entertainment. So whenever I'm responding to somebody in my head, I'm thinking that this is part of the show. It's part
Right.
of the
Yeah,
entertainment for my
definitely.
followers.
Definitely.
So in my case, I'm driven by entertainment and whether it's interesting and whether I can learn something from it. But if it's just a random troll doing a random thing, I'll just give them a block. But sometimes there's a challenge there, and there's a show. And if there's a challenge or there's a show to put on, I'm all in.
I like that distinction because whether you agree or not with you like it, right? You maybe even would say that maybe to a degree you thrive on that, whereas other people wouldn't. So whether you agree with it or not is irrelevant. I think the message we need to extract there is that you're intentional about it. You know why you do it. See,
Oh
I think
yeah.
there's a lot of people that get sucked into things and they don't even know why they're getting sucked into this vortex of whatever they want to call it. There's no intentionalities, there's no thought behind it, and therefore they're wasting a bunch of time.
Yeah. I mean, I allow myself to get sucked into exchanges that, in retrospect, I wish I had used my time for something else.
Sure, of
But I'm always,
course.
but I'm always aware of it as an entertainment vehicle. Like, you can play a video game too long, or, do anything that you like too long. So I don't think it's a big mistake if I spend time enjoying myself battling with somebody on social media because I enjoy it.
Right. Well, you seem to, and it's definitely helped me just in this book, and I know it's going to help a lot of other people as well. I did want to say something interesting, or I thought interesting, anyways, on the concept of mockery and shame, which is obviously what you're using when you talk about Loserthink, and you had mentioned it when you have witty comebacks for people who deserve it. There's a really interesting thing in society is that we shouldn't shame or put other people down. It's also the thing that I worry about with bullying, right? Everything becomes bullying. And so we have all these sorts of like anti-bullying campaigns. And, sometimes I think what other people would dub as bullying is just a bunch of boys trying to get each other to toe the line and act appropriately, right? Or to be tougher or to be stronger. Like not everything is bullying just because somebody feels bad about it.
Yeah, we're not allowed to say that there are male-female differences in anything anymore. And
Right.
so I think we lose a little bit with that because it does feel to me, and again, I'll say I haven't done a research on this, but just it seems to me, having lived in the world, that men and women have a different reaction to fighting with trolls online. When I do it, it's quite literally entertainment. And I'm not going to get hurt. Nobody's going to, come to my house and stalk me, probably.
Yeah. Well,
So I don't have any real risk, and I don't feel bad when they insult me. So there's no downside in my case. But I would imagine that women maybe just process it differently. It probably seems more threatening. I don't think I would get in. I probably wouldn't get in online battles with people I would be afraid of in the real world. Even though you think, well, they can't find me, I just don't think I would. But in the real world, there's no there's no human being I'm afraid of, short of a terrorist or something. But I'm not afraid of anybody online. I'm not afraid of men. I'm not afraid of dangerous men. That's one of the benefits of being a male, is that I go through life not being afraid of anything. I mean, on a typical day, I don't have any fear of anything physical. And I think about what it must be like to be a woman, where every time you leave the house, you have to choose your route. I mean, it's like, you're living in Baghdad or something, where you're like, IEDs on that route, there could be men there and no supervision. And that's just, I can't even imagine that world. But I take that to online. And so for me, it's just a playground. Whereas I can imagine if you lived in a world full of IEDs, that online would look like just more of that, right. Something you'd want to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have these kind of conversations with my wife, because she'll see comments that are made about me or what I'm doing, and she says, "How do you deal with that?" And I mean, I deal with it in stride, but ultimately I look at it as not only a challenge. I enjoy some verbal jousting because it's challenging. It pushes me. It hones my skills. It might even bring into question some thought that I may need to think differently about, which makes me a better human being. But I like that challenge. I enjoy that challenge. And I realize that it's par for the course, that if I want to have the levels of success that I want to have in the public eye, then that's part of the deal. And I can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I got in trouble for saying this years ago, but I'll try to say it in a more elegant way so I don't get in as much trouble. It seems
you're less likely to get in trouble being on this podcast, but you never know. Somebody might hear it and take issue with it.
It seems to me, and this is just observational, so if somebody wants to tell me I'm being unscientific, I will accept that. But observationally, men enjoy arguing with other men for entertainment. Mm-hmm. And so it's a win-win proposition. Nobody changes anybody's mind, but both the men will go away from it kind of they had fun.
Right.
Even if you hated each other at the end, it was kind of fun. Yep. I don't know that women have that experience. I feel, and I don't know how women process it, but I don't observe them arguing online for entertainment. And it's obvious that men are doing it for entertainment.
Well,
now,
women
of course, everybody's different, blah, blah, blah.
Right, but. Sure. Generally, yeah. Women tend to be more relational, right? They operate better that way. And so their whole goal in social exchange is relational, right? How can I connect these people in this organization? Men tend to be more confrontational, right? So the only reason that Scott, you and I would band together is because I'm stronger if you're with me, and vice versa, so we can go confront the enemy together. If that doesn't happen, there's no reason to have you around.
Right? Well, plus so there's better that way. And again, I have no idea how women process the world in this regard, but men try to dominate. It's quite, and we do it online, we do it in person. We try to tamp it down for the benefit of society, right? Sure. You try to repress. You try to repress some of your most aggressive instincts because it doesn't work well with society, but it's always there. I mean, I'm never not aggressive. It's just that I'm hiding it sometimes.
Well, and aggression's funny because aggression doesn't equate to physicality always or violence. I think people sometimes think it does. You can be aggressively patient even. You can be aggressively pursuing an interest in an activity without being violent. So it's just a way that we choose to express that aggression.
That is an interesting frame. I'll have to go think about that a little bit. Aggression in terms of goal achievement, sure. Aggression toward a point.
Or maybe even really intensity. Think on that.
Yeah, I'm going to think about that one.
We'll have to follow up on that conversation. Yeah. Okay. Well, Scott, I don't want to hold you up any longer. I really appreciate your insights. Let me ask you a couple of questions as we wind down here. The first one is, what do you believe it means to be a man?
Well, I do observe that there are now many definitions of genders, and I'm going to say that this might surprise you because, I do most of my talking on the political right and have more affinity for a lot of that stuff. But when it comes to gender, I am fully on board with the fact that it's infinite varieties. Now, for convenience, And for the law and for lots of just practical reasons, you have to characterize it. This is a man, this is a woman, whatever. So there's some practical implications, but I'm very much on the side that says everybody can be whatever they want. Now, I'm built a certain way. So there's a certain way I can live that works for me. And it is more classically male stuff, achievement and competition. But that's just me. It doesn't make me more of a man. I'm just one of them. And I think society itself has changed this is a bigger conversation, but society has changed in a way that our testosterone levels are absolutely different. And, you've probably seen the studies. Testosterone has dropped in men for decades. And there's all the obvious reasons. We have less manly things we're doing that would drive up your testosterone. So we now have much more variety among men. And unless you think there's something broken about that, and I don't, I just say it's different. Now, I spend most of my time doing things which by coincidence or design, I don't know, are good for my testosterone. So, I'm always exercising. I'm always fighting with somebody. I'm happy when my book is a bestseller, which this one is. So my testosterone is probably pretty jacked, but I don't think that's the one way to be.
I appreciate it. Certainly unexpected and different than we've heard in the past, but I really do appreciate the candor and insight there as well.
Thank you.
Scott, how do we connect with you? How do we pick up a copy of the book, connect with you, learn more about what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, the book's called Loserthink, and it's available everywhere they have books. You can find it. And connecting with me, the best way is on Twitter at Scott Adams Says, all one word, Scott Adams Says.
Perfect. We'll sync it all up. I just want to let you know I appreciate you. I've been following you for a while. So again, I'm glad that Jordan synced us up and want to thank you for this book because you have made me, in a few words through the book, a more intelligent individual, especially online, which I greatly appreciate. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking some time today.
Thank you so much for taking the time with me. I enjoyed this very much.
I know.